Hello everyone, this is Jeff at Mississippi in the Civil War. I'm back for episode 2 of my series on Mississippi's participation in the Civil War and the effects that the war had on the state and its people. Episode 2 is going to cover secession and the preparation for war. And a lot of people have the feeling that Mississippians were wholeheartedly in favor of secession in 1861, that there was no discussion or dissent, and that really couldn't be further from the case. And I'd like to start off by reading a quote from John K. Bettersworth, who is an excellent historian, and he wrote a very good article about the coming of the war in his book, Confederate Mississippi. And he makes the point that in 1860, Mississippians were very divided over the issue of secession. And he says in his book, quote, "Amid the welter of argumentation that ensued, Mississippians took their stand on the secession issue less upon such vague abstractions as states' rights than upon the solid practical ground of self-preservation. Fundamentally, both secessionists and unionists were concerned with the perpetuation of a certain social system. Their difference lay only in the manner of accomplishment. For wealthy planters in Natchez and non-slaveholders in the piney woods, the status quo, evil as it was sufficient unto the day." And I think that's a very telling comment. It really strikes to the heart of the feelings that a lot of Mississippians had. Some were very much in favor of quick secession to form a new slave-holding country that would protect their rights. Others, particularly those with a lot to lose, were very much concerned that, hey, we've got things good as they are now. This is a risky proposal. People are talking about secession, and they really didn't want any part of it. So you're going to see quite a lot of difference in feeling amongst Mississippians on the eve of war. And Congressman Otho R. Singleton from Mississippi expressed the sentiment of a lot of Mississippians, both slaveholders and non-slaveholders, when he said that the people of the state were, quote, "so indissolubly united in feeling and interest that if you but touch a cord connected with ether, it vibrates through our whole social system and unites in more rapid motion the blood of every heart." And he was really right about that. Slavery was a touchstone that provoked very strong emotions in just about everyone, and it was going to be the issue that was going to lead the state out of the Union. And Singleton was, in fact, very soon going to resign from the United States Congress when the state of Mississippi did secede. In the election to choose delegates to the Mississippi Secession Convention in 1861, most of the candidates were either in favor of immediate secession or were cooperationists who wanted the state to leave the Union in cooperation with other slaveholding states and not go it alone. And there were still signs of unionism in the state. In a meeting held at Caledonia, Mississippi on December 5th, 1860, of those opposed to any kind of hasty action towards secession, there was a Unionist meeting in Vicksburg about the same time, although it was, according to the papers, it was not very well attended. The Reverend John H. Augie voted against a secession candidate in Choctaw County, quote, amidst the frowns, murmurs, and threats of judges and bystanders. And in fact, because of his pro-union and very outspoken sentiments, Augie was eventually forced to flee his home and head to Union-occupied territory to avoid being arrested. The Secession Convention of Mississippi opened in Jackson on January 7, 1861, and the delegates in favor of secession were in the majority. William T.S. Berry, a fervent supporter of secession, was elected president of the convention. L.Q.C. Lamar made a motion that Berry should appoint a 15-man committee to create an ordinance of secession. On January 9th, Lamar reported that an ordinance had been drawn up by the committee to dissolve the union between Mississippi and the United States. And at this time, those delegates who were in favor of cooperation with other southern states, of not going it alone when it came to secession, introduced an amendment that the ordinance not go into effect until voted on by the people of Mississippi. This amendment was voted down by the convention by a 70-29 margin. One of the representatives to the secession convention was Thomas H. Woods, who represented DeKalb County. And he later wrote about the secession convention, and he noted the different opinions of the delegates towards secession. He said, the overwhelming sense of the people and of the convention was that the hour had struck, and that secession was at once the necessity and the safety of the state. A small minority was for clinging to the Union and fighting the battle for our rights under the old flag. Very many more favored the final step of severing the state's relations to the Union only with the cooperation of other slaveholding states first secured. But the great majority believed the time for immediate and decisive action was upon us, and that the open door security lay in separate, independent state action. And Thomas Hall Woods would go on to serve in the Confederate Army. He was a captain in Company C of the 13th Mississippi Infantry. After the war, he was an attorney and also served as a district attorney. He was also in the Mississippi State Legislature and served on the Mississippi Supreme Court, of which he served as Chief Justice. So he was a very prominent citizen. But in the vote of the convention delegates on the secession ordinance, the Ordinance of Secession was voted in, with 84-15 in favor of adoption. There were 15 delegates who voted against secession, and they were from the counties of Adams, Amite, Atala, Franklin, Itawamba, Perry, Rankin, Tishomingo, Warren, and Washington counties. And the opponents of secession at the convention were primarily from the northeastern hill section of the state, where there were not very many slaves, and most of the landholders were small farmers, and also from the counties along the Mississippi River, where you had a lot of very wealthy planters who again felt threatened that secession might destroy their entire fortunes. After their delaying tactics failed, such staunch Unionists as James L. Alcorn and former Senator Walker Brooke voted for the Ordinance of Secession, which after its passage was signed by all but 2 delegates to the convention. John W. Wood was absent the day of the signing, and J.J. Thornton of Rankin County refused to sign. And Thomas H. Wood later said of Thornton, "It is due to the memory of the only member who refused to sign the ordinance, Colonel J.J. Thornton of Rankin, that he was constrained thereto by an immovable determination to do no act which might contribute to the secession of the state, but that, when secession had been decreed, he was among the earliest to enter the army thus raised." And he was right about that. Thornton did join the Confederate Army, even though he was an opponent of secession. He served as colonel of the 6th Mississippi Infantry and was badly wounded in their first engagement at the Battle of Shiloh. In fact, so badly wounded that he was forced to retire and never returned to the unit. Now, James L. Alcorn of Coahoma County was another opponent of secession, but when the opposition movement failed, he voted for the ordinance, and as he did so, he explained his actions. He said, "Mr. President, I have thought that a different course in regard to the settlement of this great controversy should have been adopted, and to that end I have labored and spoken. But the die is cast, the Rubicon is crossed, and I enlist myself with the army that marches on Rome. I vote for the ordinance." And Alcorn would go on to serve in the Confederate state troops from Mississippi as a general of Mississippi state troops. The secession convention had 100 members, and to give just a little bit of background on them, of that 100 members of the secession convention, about 85 owned slaves, although most of them could not be considered large planters. The most ardent supporters of secession at the convention were younger men who were still building their fortunes in land and slaves. The main opposition was not from poor whites, except for a few exceptions, such as Tishomingo County, but the main opposition came from the wealthy planters who felt they had nothing to gain and everything to lose by risking secession and war. Now, after the secession convention had made its historic vote and voted in favor of separating itself from the United States, C.D. Dickinson entered the hall where the convention was being held, carrying a blue silk flag with a white star in the center. He handed it to William Barry, president of the convention, and told him that it was a gift of Mrs. H. Smythe of Jackson. The president remarked that it was the first flag to be flown by the new Mississippi Republic, and the delegates rose from their seats and cheered themselves hoarse. Now, one of the people that was in Jackson at the time was Harry Mccarthy, and he was a well-known Irish comedian. And after hearing of the episode with this new flag, he wrote a song entitled "The Bonnie Blue Flag," and this song became one of the most popular Confederate patriotic songs of the war. It would be sung by thousands of Mississippians and by people throughout the Confederacy during the course of the war. Now, not everyone was happy to learn that the state of Mississippi had seceded. In particular, a lot of people in Jones County were very angry, particularly because they had elected a delegate to the secession convention that they thought was pro-Union. But he kind of got caught up in the whole excitement of the atmosphere at the convention, and he voted in favor of secession. And the people back home were ticked. In fact, they were so upset with him that they hung him in effigy when they learned that he had voted for secession. And I don't know if he went back home, but I'm sure he had a very warm reception when he got back to Jones County. And you will be hearing more about the Unionists in Jones County as we go along, because they were going to prove to be a very unruly bunch. Now, many Unionists did not agree with the need for secession, but once it was an accomplished fact, quite a lot of them did rally to the defense of the state of Mississippi. Another good example is Benjamin G. Humphries, who was originally from Port Gibson but had moved to Sunflower County before the war. He was a Unionist. He opposed secession, but once it happened, he wholeheartedly supported the state of Mississippi, and in fact would eventually become a general in the Confederate Army. And he later explained his decision to fight on the Confederate side, and he said, "My nativity fixed my allegiance to Mississippi. Beneath her soil my ancestors and my children slept in death. All I held dear on earth, family, friends, and property, welded me to that soil by the strongest cement of nature. Her God was my God. Her people were my people. Her interests were my interests. Her sympathies were my sympathies. I could not, did not deliberate after war was inaugurated and brought to her door sills. I cast my lot with my mother state. As she had across the Rubicon, I determined to march with her armies, whether her warpath led to Rome or ruin." And I think that's a sentiment that a lot of Mississippians who were reluctant about secession held. Now, other Unionists with ties to Mississippi had to search their hearts and made the very difficult decision to break with their state. A good example is Tully McRae. He was a cadet at West Point when Mississippi seceded, and he was born in Natchez, and he had been sent to live with an uncle in Ohio when his parents died when he was 14. And during his time spent in Ohio, McRae became a Unionist and a supporter of the Republican Party. And McRae wrote of his native state at the time of secession, "I hope that Mississippi will not be so foolish as to try to secede. Although a Republican, I remember my native state and am concerned in its welfare and prosperity. I think that it would lose everything and gain nothing by seceding from the Union. And McRae still, even though his parents were dead, he still had family in the Natchez area, and they were very upset by his decision to remain in the Union and to remain at West Point as a cadet. McRae wrote in one of his letters, Aunt Margaret sent me word that she would rather see me dead in my grave than to see me remain in the North during the present war. It grieves me very much to cause Aunt Margaret pain, for I have reason to remember her with love and gratitude. And he would stick to his guns. McRae would remain at West Point. He would graduate, and he would go on to serve with a great deal of distinction in the Union Army during the Civil War. But these were the kinds of choices that a lot of people had to make, and they were not easy choices. You had to make the choice between, a lot of times, between family and what you considered your duty to your country. And that was not a decision to be made lightly, because there were going to be consequences no matter which way you went. So you really have to appreciate the kind of pressure that a lot of people were put under with the coming of secession. Now, after the voting to leave the Union, the Mississippi Secession Convention remained in session to modify the government of the state of what was now being called, quote, the Republic of Mississippi. The convention retained the existing state constitution with a few modifications, one of which was removing the requirement of all office holders to pledge an oath of allegiance to the United States. And at the same time, all rights guaranteed under the U.S. and state constitutions remained intact, if not in conflict with the Ordinance of Secession. The convention also created the position of Postmaster General. It appointed Jefferson Davis as Major General in command of all military forces in the state, and it also appointed 4 Brigadier Generals to serve under him. They also adopted, for the first time, a state flag. Prior to the Secession Convention, Mississippi didn't have a state flag, but they adopted as a state flag a device with a blue canton with a white star, and on the white field was a magnolia tree. The convention also selected delegates to send to a meeting at Montgomery, Alabama, for the purpose of organizing a Southern Confederacy. And the convention also did one other very important thing. They adopted a declaration outlining the reasons that Mississippians felt compelled to secede from the Union, entitled A Declaration of the Immediate Causes Which Induce and Justify the Secession of the State of Mississippi from the Federal Union. This document makes it very plain that Mississippians were seceding because they felt that their right to keep and own slaves was being threatened by the national government. And just to quote a very small portion of this very long document, it said, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portion of the commerce of the earth. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has long been aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles have been subverted to work our ruin." And the Mississippi Secession Convention adjourned on January 26, 1861, but then reconvened 2 months later, and on March 29th, by a vote of 78-7, ratified the Constitution that had been created at Montgomery, Alabama, and Mississippi did formally become part of the Confederate States of America. In the meantime, on February 18, 1862, Mississippi native Jefferson Davis took the oath of office at Montgomery as Provisional President of the Confederate States of America. After the secession of Mississippi was an established fact, the citizens of the state began preparing themselves for war, because I don't think very many people believed that the United States was going to allow the southern states to leave without a fight. And young Mississippians by the thousands began rushing to recruiting offices to sign up to fight. And you could certainly say the war was swept by war fever. Baxter McFarland of Chickasaw County wrote about this great rush to join up. He said, "Preparations for the war impending were everywhere energetically pushed, with the grim determination to meet force with force resorted to. The people of the South were agitated and excited as never before in the history of the country. The young and the old, men, women, and children of every condition in life were roused to the highest pitch. The young men rushed to arms amidst the fervent plaudits of its devoted women." And as part of the preparations for war, an artillery company was sent from Jackson to Vicksburg, where they were joined a number of local volunteers to help fortify Fort Hill to prevent Northern troops from moving down the river. On January 11th, 1861, the artillery at Fort Hill opened fire on the steamboat A.O. Tyler for failing to stop for an inspection. There was a lot of rumors going around at the time that the Northerners were going to invade, that there were arms being sent to foment a slave insurrection. So there was a lot of paranoia going on. The North was still getting organized as well. They had no way of making a organized push this early, but the A.O. Tyler was going about its business, had no idea it needed to stop for an inspection, and when they failed to do so, a small cannon did fire a warning shot at the ship. Fortunately, no one was injured, and once the Tyler realized something was going on, they pulled over for an inspection, and no one was injured. The cannon that fired this first shot was later captured by the Union forces after the siege of Vicksburg ended, and it is now on display at West Point Military Academy out in front of one of the buildings. In fact, you can see it in the bottom picture here. It's the cannon on the left of this doorway. The first Mississippians to leave the state were those that were sent to the aid of the state of Florida to help seize several federal forts and the naval yard at Pensacola. Governor John J. Pettus ordered 7 volunteer companies to Florida on January 11, 1861, and these were the first Mississippians to leave the state. There would be thousands that were going to follow them in the months and years to come. 22-year-old Baxter McFarland was part of this expedition, and he later wrote of it, quote, "It was the first aggressive movement in which Southern states acted in concert and dispelled all doubt as to their future cooperation." These were the first Mississippians to leave the state during the war. There would be thousands to follow in the years to come. Nothing came of this expedition because the authorities were not eager at this point to start a shooting war with the United States. In early February, the Mississippians were disbanded, and most of them were sent home, and most of them very promptly joined up with new units. On March 9, 1861, the Confederate government made its first call to the state of Mississippi for soldiers. And Governor Pettus was asked to send 1,500 men again to Pensacola to help with the capture of Fort Pickens, which was still held by the federal government. The governor sent 20 companies to Florida, and they would end up being organized as the 9th and 10th Regiments of Mississippi Infantry, and they were transferred into Confederate service on April 14, 1861. On January 20th, 1861, Mississippi State troops seized the naval installation at Ship Island, just off the coast of the state, and 3 days later, the Secession Convention moved to organize the Army of Mississippi for the protection of the state. And as I mentioned before, Jefferson Davis was appointed a major general commanding the Army of the state of Mississippi, and under him were appointed 4 brigadier generals. And from the left here, they are Earl Van Dorn, Charles Clark, James L. Alcorn, and Christopher H. Mott. These 5 generals plus Governor Pettus made up the military board that was responsible for organizing the new Army of Mississippi. And this military board adopted a very colorful uniform for the Army of Mississippi. It consisted of gray frock coats and pants, trimmed in red for artillery, or trimmed in red for infantry, yellow for cavalry, and orange for artillery. The hats that they wore were to be of black felt, looped up on 3 sides into a tricorn, with horsehair pom-poms for enlisted men and plumes for officers. And although there was quite a bit of variation, many Mississippians did go to war wearing some variation of this uniform. Now, this was a very fancy uniform, and it was not going to survive very long out in the field. Very quickly, you're going to see the men switching to a much plainer, simpler, easier to maintain uniform for field duty. And in the first 6 months after it was created, membership on the military board changed very often. Davis was very soon going to be called to become the first president of the Confederacy, and his successors, Earl Van Dorn and then Charles Clark, were going to take commissions in the Confederate Army. And in July 1861, Reuben Davis took over as Major General of the State Army. The Ordinance of Secession that had been adopted did authorize the state to raise 8 regiments of infantry, and soon companies of men all over the state began gathering to form these units. Many of these local companies were going to take up nicknames that showed pride in their hometowns, and they'd be called things like the Tishomingo Riflemen or the Liberty Guards, or some took names with political meanings, such as the Mississippi Yankee Hunters or the Jeff Davis Sharpshooters. Now, the Army of Mississippi was going to have a very short life, because after the Confederate States of America was formed, most of the troops being raised in Mississippi were going to be joining the Confederate Army. And so this army was going to be not around for very long. But at this point, actual fighting had not started, but tensions were running very high, particularly over the continued federal occupation of southern forts in southern harbors. In particular, Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor was a flashpoint, and President Jefferson Davis issued the first general call for troops to enter Confederate service, and on April 8th he asked for 3,000 more men from Mississippi for 12 months service. On April 12th, Confederate forces in Charleston Harbor opened fire on the fort, and on April 14th, the forts did surrender. Very soon thereafter, President Abraham Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers in the United States to suppress what he called, quote, combinations too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. Now, this announcement immediately prompted the upper southern states of Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee to leave the Union and join the Confederacy rather than take up arms against their fellow Southerners. The Vicksburg Artillery from the town of Vicksburg was in Mobile on its way to Pensacola by train when the members of the unit heard about the firing on Fort Sumter. An unidentified member of the battery described the celebration that ensued after receiving the news. He said, "It is now near midnight, and the excitement is beginning to abate. The battle house and telegraph office have been thronged for hours, and speeches were made by many prominent Southerners. Many ladies were out and shared in the patriotic sentiment, and even now at this late hour, the newsboys sing out, 'Latest dispatches, extra, extra!' And in the distance I hear the revelry and shouts of applause for the gallant Beauregard and the Southern Confederacy." That was from a letter printed in the Evening Citizen of Vicksburg, Mississippi, April 19th, 1861. And after the attack on Fort Sumter, Jefferson Davis asked for an additional 5,000 men from Mississippi to serve in the Confederate Army. And on May 21st, 1861, Governor Pettus ordered 50 companies to muster into service at Corinth. Out of these 50 companies, 5 regiments were formed, and 2 more were formed in June after the government made an additional request for men. The state of Mississippi had no trouble filling these initial requests, as men were flocking to serve in under arms. And to give you an idea, in 1860, Mississippi's male population between the ages of 15 and 50 was about 88,286. By the time the war ended, an estimated somewhere between 78 and 82,000 men of the state served in military service. As early as September 1861, Mississippi had 25,000 men in the field, and many towns in the state were almost devoid of young men. Wiley P. Harris commented on this fact in a letter to Jefferson Davis when he wrote on September 30th, 1861, "You would be struck with the aspect our state now presents. Except in the principal towns, the country appears to be deserted. There are not more men left than the demands of society and the police of the slaveholding country actually require." Now, not all Mississippians were anxious to see their sons go marching off to war. Mrs. Mary H. Williams of Pike County wrote on April 14, 1861, quote, "Maya has been in the fields alone, as Reuben and Jackson are just like everybody else. Can't wait to get a gun and a uniform and parade all over the countryside. I worry too because the Lord God does not mean for the people of a country to war against one another, but everybody says we are not the same as the people in the North." And she had good reason to worry. One of her sons, Reuben, was going to die of disease in Columbus, Mississippi in June of 1862 while serving with the 38th Mississippi Infantry. And the Mississippians who heeded calls like this one seen here did so for a number of reasons. Some went for excitement and adventure. Others went because they felt it was expected of them by friends and family. But for the vast majority of Mississippians who enlisted in the first 2 years of the war, probably the prime motivating factor was patriotism. And fortunately, Civil War soldiers from Mississippi wrote a great deal, and we can turn to their letters and diaries to hear firsthand why they went to war. Private Robert A. Moore of the 17th Mississippi Infantry wrote, "Our country calls, and he that would not respond deserves not the name of man, and though we fall battling for our rights, and are determined to have them or die in the attempt." And Moore was, in fact, killed at the Battle of Chickamauga, Georgia, September 20th, 1863. Calvin McCaleb helped to organize a company on the campus of Ole Miss, and he told Governor Pettus that his unit consisted of 50 men, quote, "as enthusiastic as those who love freedom should be. Our motto is Ducit Amor Patri, quote, the love of my country leads me." And McCaleb would also die in service on February 22nd, 1864. And many Southerners, even those who owned no slaves, joined up in 1861 to protect their homes and loved ones from the threat of Northern invasion. Thomas B. Weber of the 9th Mississippi Infantry wrote on June 15, 1861, quote, "I would give all I have got just to be in the front rank of the 1st Brigade that marches against the invading foe who now pollute the sacred soil of my native state with their unholy tread." And he would get his wish. He would be amongst the first Mississippians to fight. He would fight in the Battle of Santa Rosa Island in Florida. And unfortunately, he would see his own brother killed in that battle. And so this was kind of a wake-up call for him. But he would go on to fight with great distinction throughout the remainder of the war. And this brings to a conclusion episode 2. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a like. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so, because it really helps me gauge the interest in doing more of these episodes. And I do have several more episodes in this series to do. Stay tuned for them. I should have the next episode out hopefully with, sometime later in this coming week. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them for me. I'd be happy to answer them for you. And thank you very much for viewing.